Well, it's great to see so many of you joining us today for what's going to be a great discussion. I am Shelley Rogers. I am here at Liberty Fund with the web team. I would like to introduce Arnold Kling. He is our curator from the shelf with Curator Arnold Kling. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know that we are going to open it up for questions about 20-30 minutes into the discussion. So please use either the Q&A or the raise hand. Arnold?
Okay, so I'm welcoming Lauren Hall, who I haven't met, to discuss this, but she's written on topics that overlap with this book. Lauren, you want to give us a minute or so of introduction beyond that?
Sure. I'm currently Associate Dean of Academic Affairs at the Rochester Institute of Technology in the College of Liberal Arts. I write on a variety of issues related to the classical liberal tradition, but I also have written on, and a lot of my current work looks at politics of gender and the family. And so a lot of this relates to generational questions sort of broadly. And then in my current role as Associate Dean, I'm very interested in a lot of these generational questions in terms of what the next, what incoming students are going to look like and how this is going to affect broader serious challenges in higher education.
Okay. Okay, so the book we're discussing is Generations by Jean Twenge, and one of my complaints about books nowadays is that they're not information dense. Especially if you read older books, you find that it takes the author a long time to get to the point. I would not make that complaint about this book. I took many notes on it and only used a few of the notes actually when I wrote up my review for Liberty Fund. So we're going to talk about the big general themes of the book, but I thought we'd start the discussion by talking about things. There are many, many findings in the book, findings in every chapter that, she's looking at surveys of attitudes or surveys of behaviors of different generations. And the one I'll list one finding that sort of reinforced my view and one finding that kind of surprised me and was counterintuitive. What reinforced my view was her findings that today's young people often have not dated at the same age that those of us in my generation had dated and had not had a driver's license. And I encountered that. I was teaching high school from 2001 through 2016. And when I started, I felt very much like I could relate to the students. They seemed like what I was like when I was teaching high school seniors, what I was like in that age. By the time it ended, I felt like I couldn't relate to them. And I thought maybe I had gotten older. But I definitely noticed that they were not dating and had no interest in driving. And I think the driver's license issue is, the more I think about it, is symbolic of or representative of a larger characteristic of, when I was growing up, I'll be the old man. When I was a kid, we couldn't wait to escape our parents and be treated like adults. And I just don't get that sense of motivation at all, or I didn't get that sense of motivation at all for high school seniors as of 2016. That just wasn't a factor for them. And so my line was, 17 is the new 15. And Jean Twenge actually takes that farther. She says 18-year-olds seem like 14-year-olds from, let's say, the 1970s. So that kind of reinforced a view of mine. What surprised me was her saying that the baby boomer generation is the most conservative of the generations politically. And that goes against the stereotype of, for those of us who grew up with, sympathetic to the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement. So, and I'm not sure I entirely buy it as a complete story that, but we'll get into that later. So Lauren, what are the findings that reinforced you and maybe a couple that surprised you?
Yeah, I think the one that confirmed some patterns that I've seen among college students and just in conversations I've had with both millennials, which is my generation, and Gen Z, which is the generation I'm teaching right now, is that there's a deep and probably not rational pessimism in these generations. And I thought that was really interesting. In the section on millennials, she points out that millennials have very, very negative views about their economic prospects, despite the fact that they actually have better on average, or at least as good economic prospects as the generation before. But you see this binary all the time, particularly on social media, about the millennials claiming that they can't buy a house, for example. And we actually look at the data, and housing prices and housing access is actually about the same as it was before. And the same thing is very much true among Gen Z. When I teach college students today, what strikes me about them is just a deep pessimism about where we are right now on social justice, on the economy, on a range of other issues. And a lot of that pessimism is just not supported by the data. So I thought that was really interesting that pattern comes through in the book, and she actually does, I think, a nice job of demonstrating how those beliefs are not in fact supported by the data that we have about economic prospects, gender discrimination, social justice, right? We're actually better off than most people in those generations think. So that was the one that sort of confirmed things. The one that I found surprising, and you pointed to this one, is the current generation, Gen Z's lack of sort of dating, relationship, and sexual experience. So I did not realize that they're not dating. They're having they're having fewer sexual encounters and fewer partners overall. And she attributes that to online dating, and the fact that actually what's happening is that the dating pool is being polarized. And so there's more haves and have-nots now among dating, in part because we're using these dating sites as a kind of filter, which means that looks matter more. It's easier to just sort of ignore people if they don't fit your ideal kind of person. Whereas when you were doing more dating in meeting people in bars or churches or wherever, college classes, people were looking at a more holistic view of the person in front of them. So I thought that was really interesting that we're seeing this kind of change in dating behavior that's actually having trickle-down effects into things like marriage. And then I think the pessimism is linked to some of the reproductive trends that she points to as well, which I think will come up in our later discussion.
Okay, yeah, I actually wrote something on my Substack about how I asked, how did my genes survive? Because I am 5'3" and the dating apps would just rule me out by 2 standard deviations of below what any woman would tolerate on a dating app. And it's just so that but I'm not sure I would attribute the lack of dating just to that. I mean, I think it might be some of the other things that she talks about, including the slow life trajectory. Mm-hmm. So one of her themes, one of her claims she makes early is that generation explains a lot. In fact, explains more than other stuff. And I'm not sure I buy that. So I go through a thought experiment. Suppose I'm setting up a dinner party. I'm placing people at a table at a dinner party, and I've got a college-educated woman born in 1950. And do I sit her next to a non-college educated man born in 1950? So same age, but very different social class. Or do I sit her next to a college-educated woman born in 2000? Sort of similar social milieu, but different generation. And my instinct, my first thought is she'd be more uncomfortable seated next to the non-college educated man of her generation. He might support Donald Trump, and she absolutely would not. So I think on that issue, and some other issues, they'd feel uncomfortable. But then I thought about it more, and they might have something in common talking about grandchildren, or their children and grandchildren, and issues like that. She couldn't necessarily relate to the 20-year-old or the 25-year-old talking about. So I guess I feel ambivalent about that. I guess I would rather believe that other factors dominate, but if I think about that thought experiment, maybe the 70-year-old and the 20-year-old college educated women really don't have as much in common as I would have assumed. I don't know.
Yeah, I think I went into her research originally. I think I read her book iGen a few years ago for a department retreat, I think, and then this is sort of my reintroduction to her work. I think I was pretty ambivalent about the concept too, but when reading this book, I think she does a nice job of laying out what she thinks the primary mechanisms are. And for her, the primary mechanism is technology, that the way that each generation has used and experienced technology represents this kind of fundamental shift in how they think about the world, how they interact with the world, how they interact with each other. And that does seem to me to be, and I'm in that millennial generation where I didn't have a cell phone until grad school. I didn't have social media until grad school. So I very much grew up in the analog world and then pivoted to the digital world in my mid to late 20s. And I saw pretty dramatic shifts there too, in terms of how people sort of shifted in their thinking about interacting with each other and interacting with technology. So from my perspective, that mechanism of technology makes a lot of sense. If it were just a sort of more broad argument that generations do something magical to people, I would definitely have some concerns. And she also points out, and this is another thing I found interesting, is the educational changes, right? That this current generation now has, or I guess Gen Z, has a much higher proportion of people going to college. But there's a wrinkle that maybe we'll talk about later, which is, college means something different now than it did 30 or 40 years ago. So there's interesting sort of shifts in how all of these kinds of things play out. But to me, that what I thought was really interesting about the book was that link to technology.
So just so we don't lose that thread, you want to spell out how they treat college differently? I mean, it seems like RIT, where you are, was always, sort of engineering focused, and that would, are the people really approaching that much differently at that school? I could see it at other places, but.
They are to a certain degree. So I teach in the College of Liberal Arts. And so there's, I think the big shift that I've seen, I've been at RIT now for 15 years. And so the big shift that I've seen is that parents are much more involved in the process. They really, really want students to take courses and major in things that have immediate career applications. So there isn't a lot of comfort with sort of education in the liberal tradition now, whereas I think there was a little bit more comfort with that, which is, you go to college to become an educated person and then you figure out where you're going from there. My experience with this generation is that they're very, very uncomfortable with that. And a lot of that I think has to do with student loans, the fact that it's much more expensive to go to school. People expect an immediate payoff in a way that they didn't before. So there's probably a lot of variables at work. But the other thing that she notes in the book is just this generational norm shift of the expectation now is that you go to college. Whereas before, you could go into the skilled trades, you could do a variety of different things and still actually have a good middle class life. And now the expectation among Gen Z, and I think it started really with millennials, but but particularly with Gen Z, is that you have to go to college. And so there's this expectation that this is not only something that we do culturally, but it's also something that we take out loans to pay for. And that creates a lot of kind of vicious cycles that affect how this generation thinks about the value of education.
Okay. Okay, so that's sort of one theme, is that generations matter, and she's got this technology story, but one of her themes doesn't have to do with technology, and it's more of a trend. It's not a discrete thing, and that's what she calls a trend toward individualism. Does she think about individualism the way you think about individualism?
No, and this is actually something an idea I've been playing around with for a long time. In my first book, which looks at the politics of the family, I talk about something that I call social individualism, which is this kind of an understanding of individualism as rooted in a community. And so there's a balance between rights and duties. There's an understanding that you have obligations as a result of the benefits that you receive from living in a community. It affects the way that we think about reproduction and family life. And the kind of individualism that she's talking about is it's almost, and you might have a better phrase for this, but I mean, it almost veers into a kind of solipsism, right? It's like an existential kind of individualism where it's about self-discovery and self-invention and self-definition. And it doesn't see, that kind of individualism doesn't really see itself connected to a community, to a group in any kind of meaningful way. And it's certainly not I think it is a certain type of individualism. Maybe it's the kind of isolating individualism that Tocqueville talks about, right? That was the danger point he saw the US sort of veering toward. So maybe she's identifying that, but it's certainly not the kind of individualism that I think we typically think about in the classical liberal tradition, where there's individual freedom alongside deep responsibilities that coexist.
Yeah, well, I think maybe some of that has to do with, I think of the internet in general and smartphones in particular as smashing together what used to be two different worlds, the intimate world and the remote world. So the intimate world is your friends, family, your immediate coworkers, and the remote world is celebrities, politicians, and so on. And on your smartphone, you try to look like a celebrity, and you think that when you follow a celebrity, you kind of feel close to them. That's a different thing. And then and one of the consequences of spending a lot of time online like that is that you are less connected to what used to be the intimate world. So you're not going to church, you're not hanging out with friends and really being present with them and so on. You're not, and your community spirit has to do with your ideology as opposed to I'm doing a local fundraiser and helping people in the soup kitchen near me. So I think that is sort of consistent with her type of individualism. It sort of fosters that kind of individualism as opposed to drawing a lot of your sense of belonging from your community.
Mm-hmm.
So I gather from your book that you were not a fan of individualism as you defined it, or the individualism that got away from the local community. Is that?
Yeah, well, so in the book, I argue more or less that the family operates as a kind of balancing point between it sort of prevents you from tipping into dangerous collectivism or dangerous individualism. And I think there is a kind, and I think it does that because it just forces you to kind of live together in community in an intimate way with other people. It's hard to be in a family in a purely remote or digital form. Like, I mean, that's one of the areas that like you're still kind of smashed together, even though we actually do see some interesting kind of patterns in family life changing across generations. So in the book, the kind of individualism that I critique is closer to, I think, the examples that I use are the sort of very strong individualist thinkers like Ayn Rand and Murray Rothbard, who I think kind of misunderstand the relationship between the individual and the community. And I don't think that's the kind of individual that Twenge is pointing to, but I think there's a similar, what I see in my students today that I would identify as a kind of individualism is this idea that you create your own identity out of sort of whole cloth, right? This idea that you have this sort of radical autonomy to redefine yourself, to rethink yourself. And yet at the same time, there's a kind of odd paradox there, because actually they really do tend to define themselves in terms of things that they see on social media. So it's not this radical autonomy. It's actually very tightly linked to these messages that they're getting from other people on, for example, TikTok or Twitter or whatever. But it does seem to be a different kind of individualism. And it's, again, not the one that I tend to think of as a positive individualism. But she points out, one of the things I like about the book is that she points out there's trade-offs, right? I mean, there are trade-offs to each generation's way of thinking about how individuals relate to their communities. And this generation has more empathy. She points out that millennials, for example, have a lot of empathy, even though she points out that like millennials, which is my generation, right, are high on narcissism, but also relatively high on empathy, which was kind of interesting. So, I think there's kind of different traits come out at different times based on how people are thinking about themselves in relation to other people.
Okay, well, I think we could stretch this out more, but I just want to get the one other theme of the slow life trajectory or slow life path. What do you make of that theme?
Yeah, that one is interesting because we're seeing actually some, so my background in undergrad was actually evolutionary theory and evolutionary psychology. And from an evolutionary perspective, this slow life makes a lot of sense as we expand the lifespan, right? As people start living longer and longer, you will see reproduction drag out into later years. So there is a kind of interesting sort of biological component to that. And a lot of that has to do with resource scarcity and how people access resources. And she links a lot of that to technology via education. So as things are getting more technical, we need more education in order to compete in the current economy. And so people are investing more in education, which is pushing their reproductive decisions out longer. And so there's a longer childhood, a longer adolescence, a longer educational pathway. And then, people aren't having kids until they're in their late 30s, early 40s, depending on their economic situation. There are still, though, a lot of variations. And that's what I think her book probably ignores, is that a lot of the slow life is much more common among middle class folks. There's still, I think, quite a pretty strong phenomenon of a fast life approach among people of lower socioeconomic status, particularly people who live in relatively high crime areas. And there have been a series of anthropologists who have done research on this phenomenon, but we find that children in the inner city, for example, will often reach puberty earlier, have children earlier, and that their life process is actually sped up. And so it may not be as much a generational thing as it is a human reaction to the kinds of resources you have access to and how you think about those resources and your lifespan.
But it does seem like there's a pretty large cohort who are delaying childbearing to the point where they're not going to have children, or they're going to have much smaller families than even they think is normal. I mean, I think, I mean, I just had grandchildren with us for a whole week, and I cannot imagine a 38-year-old having multiple, 3 or 4 kids. I mean, just coping with it. I think you might think, well, I'll start having a family at 35 and I'll have 4 kids, but by the time you get the first 2, you got to be pretty worn out. I think it's really, and there's, just the biological clock anyway. So do you think that trend toward postponing having the first child until, mid-30s is sustainable, or will the pendulum have to swing, or will something happen?
I don't know. I mean, so I don't think it's sustainable in one sense, because I think we're already below replacement rate, and that's not a great place to be. And a lot of other countries are in much worse shape than we are when it comes to actually reproducing themselves and making sure that there's enough people in the next generation to do the stuff that needs to happen. But I know from my own experience, as I have 3 young kids, and I can say that there was a really frustrating article in The Atlantic a few years ago that the title was, women still can't have it all. And I remember thinking to myself, what a bizarre thing to say, right? Because nobody gets to have it all, right? There's always trade-offs in terms of how people approach really high value activities. And so I really love my job. I really love my children. Those are both high value activities. It's really hard to get those things to work together and balance, right? And I think that's true for men, that's true for women. It's probably more true for women because women tend to be more emotionally invested in being present for their children. And that, I don't mean that I mean, culturally, that's the expectation we have. And so I think we're going to reach a crisis point. And I think I'm saying this from talking to a lot of my professional female friends with kids, that they feel as though they are at a kind of breaking point. Many of them have fewer children than they would like to have, but they also don't feel as though they have the support from the broader culture. One of the biggest things that Twenge points to is childcare costs, which have just been completely, I mean, it's the one thing that is way off in terms of inflation, right? Like matching inflation. So I don't think we're actually in a sustainable model. And a lot of women too, especially very well-educated women, are now realizing that this, their professional aspirations, their reproductive aspirations are now completely conflicting when it comes to that biological clock. So people are waiting until they're 37 to have kids and then finding out that it's a lot harder to do than they realized. And so you have more and more people using IVF and various kinds of fertility, which is itself really hard and really hard on your body and psychologically, and it's expensive. So I don't see this as sustainable, but I'm not sure I don't know if we're going to get a generation of women who decide to have children earlier. I'm not sure what the next move is there, because it does not feel sustainable right now.
Okay, and let me throw one more at you, and then hopefully we'll turn to the audience. How much do you think that the general pessimism, the increase in pessimism, plays into this sort of not getting married soon enough, not having kids soon enough?
I think it's huge. I was actually talking to my in-laws about this last night, and we were commenting on how my in-laws got married when they were in college, and they just knew that they were going to be poor for a long time. They had kids and just knew they were going to be poor while they were getting their feet under them. And my father-in-law is a teacher, or he was a teacher, and my mother-in-law was a nurse, and they just knew that this was, you just struggled in your 20s and 30s, but you still had a family. You didn't wait for the pieces to fall into place before you had the family. You had the family and figured it out while you were going. And now it feels to me like people wait until they have the economic pieces in place. They wait until they have that kind of everything in place. But if you view the overall picture as really bad, right? If you're waiting for the economic pieces to fall into place and you feel deeply pessimistic about the economic future, then you are going to put off reproduction for much longer than maybe even you would like to, because you just don't know, because it's not the right time, right? It's never the right time. So I see the two going hand in hand. And I do think there's something about, I mean, I think reproduction is a profoundly optimistic act, right? You're having kids on the assumption that they're going to make your life better, that they're going to make the world better, that they're going to be okay human beings. And I get the impression from the college students that I work with that a lot of them simply do not trust that the world will be a good enough place to have kids in. And so that, I think, is feeding into this in a deep way.
Okay, Shelley, do we have some people from the audience who want to toss things in?
We do. John, I'm gonna let you in. You've asked some pretty good questions in the Q&A. So let's bring him over. Go ahead, John, you're ready.
I have questions about the concept of a generation. My intuition is that it's a slippery concept. When does a generation start and end? And Jean Twenge makes a case that specific events, for example, technology shock or a deep recession, might create a generation by their impacts on psychology and culture. On the other hand, I just get a strong impression that a lot of the discussion about generations, take, for example, millennials, defined by the year 2000, right? It just seems to involve ad hoc or arbitrary boundaries. So I guess I'm starting, my question is are these concepts natural kinds? Are they carving the world at its joints? One thing I don't know if Jean Twenge goes into it is whether changes in, to me, it seems like changes in sex ratio might be a good candidate. Sex ratio and higher educational attainment in particular might be a good candidate for defining when a generation takes shape, because sex ratios has such an impact on psychology and culture among young elites and in the so-called marriage market, if people want to marry at their education level. And then, well, should I stop there? I had other questions.
Yeah, well, Warren, you want to take a shot at some of those?
Sure. I'm probably not going to be very satisfying. I do think, I mean, I think she admits that these are arbitrary points, right? And I think she tries to sort of look at, and she admits this, when originally generations were about 20 years and now they're getting closer and closer together. So I think the shortest one is, what is it? 14 years, or maybe the Gen Z is even shorter. Yeah, Gen Z is actually even shorter, 1995 to 2012. And she says, well, the reason that we're getting shorter, the generations are getting shorter, is that the pace of technological change is speeding up. And so the world that I grew up in as a millennial is very different from the world that my kids are growing up in. And I think she's right. I mean, looking at the way my 10-year-old is already reacting to and thinking about technology, right? She's facing pressures that I simply never faced. And it's making parenting really hard, because I don't know exactly how to navigate these problems, because I don't exactly know. So I find it at least somewhat satisfying that she's tying this to sort of the pace of technological and cultural change. But I agree with you that this is ultimately it is ultimately a construct, right? It's a way of trying to sort of break human groups into different buckets and seeing what patterns emerge. And there are absolutely other ones. Like I mentioned, the inner city, people growing up in high crime, high poverty areas versus middle class Americans. The distance between those two groups probably swamps any generational difference, right? I would think. And
right.
And it certainly doesn't seem to have the same effects on slowing, right? I mean, we're not seeing the slow life effects in the inner city that we are in the suburbs. So I do think we have to be realistic about what it can explain.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because the overall the contrast between what Charles Murray calls Belmont and Fishtown, that is two cultures that are very different, two psychologies that are very different, seems much more consequential than than any chronological shift. Even, I'm not discounting technology shock. Then I guess my last question about what defines a generation is maybe it's just a concept that can be defined inductively by emergent patterns in data about behaviors and attitudes. Maybe generation is a statistical concept. It emerges from the data and in the hands of a skilled data analyst, or is that kind of narrowly empirical approach to defining a generation? Is that insufficient?
Arnold, I
Yeah,
don't know if you want to take that one. Yeah.
I think it's also just a like a heuristic device or a mnemonic device. It's like, talked about these two main causal factors or trends, the trend toward individualism and the slow lifestyle. Neither of those are discrete, right? Those are continuous variables that are, happening over time. And then, on top of that, you layer some discrete events, which may or may not make a difference, like, the explosion of the World Wide Web, or the explosion of the smartphone and social media, or the financial crisis of 2008. And I think that, I think in some ways the generational labels are just handy for talking about, but not really. I don't think I wouldn't want to claim, and I don't think I would want to claim that they have some precise scientific standing.
Thank you.
I do like the way, John, though, that you mentioned the idea of them emerging from the data. And I think that's what she points out with Gen Z, for example. I mean, there are some really clear shifts you see in terms of unhappiness and the mental health crisis, for example, right? That's emerging from the data. That's not something we necessarily could have predicted. It's not something that you could have said like, well, this is clearly the decade. But she points to 2012 as being kind of that crucial tipping point with social media and smartphones. And that is a pattern that seems to have emerged from the data that does seem to demonstrate a substantial shift in the culture that has real and long-term effects on how people understand themselves.
Thank you.
John, I have Juliet Selgren next to me. She is the host of our podcast, The Great Antidote, on the Adam Smith Works website. She has a couple questions.
Hey guys, I've interviewed you both, so here I am. I'm also a Gen Zer, so it feels a little relevant to me. Recently I've been thinking a lot about this optimism thing. I think especially within like classical liberalism, it's hard because we consider ourselves realists, but we're like optimists, or we're like real about being optimists, or like, you know what I mean. But I think this pessimism trend is really, I don't want to say frightening, but it's a little worrying because especially like I'm learning about all the economic effects of pessimism and like expectations theories and like how bad it can be because it just multiplies upon itself and it's like a snowball that just, and that can be really bad. And especially with the unhappiness, it is a little worrying. And so I guess like my question in part is like, how do we change this? Like, what should we be doing? Like Lauren, as a professor, like what have you been doing, and what should professors in universities be doing versus like as writers, what should we be doing as thinkers and just individuals in our communities? What do we do? What's your general advice?
I am deeply worried about pessimism. I'm actually really seriously worried about pessimism. And the main reason I'm worried about pessimism is actually for some of the reasons that you point out. I think Gen Z is so deeply pessimistic for the wrong reasons that it's making them question and undermine the very institutions that have gotten us to this place of flourishing. So I'm actually very scared of where this deep-seated pessimism is going to go. I mean, when I teach my students, and I ask them sort of what their biggest fears are, I can't tell you how many people point to capitalism And what I think they mean is cronyism. Like, I think that's kind of what they're, right, like corporatism and corporate capitalism. But you know, I try to get them to sort of untangle what it is about capitalism that they're concerned about, but then I also try to just present them with the data, right? 2023 is still the best time to be alive. And you have to kind of keep like repeating that message, I think, over and over again. But it is there, we have a serious problem of negativity bias in the media. Social media builds in a negativity bias via algorithms. And then people hear it all day long from their peers and from their from other professors. I mean, I can't tell you how many of my fellow faculty think that we're living in a deeply terrible time to be alive, which is just astonishing because all of the data suggests the opposite. So I think we have to keep pushing back against it. I mean, the way that I do it in my classes is I just present a lot of data. And I actually think this, she does a really great job at countering the narrative, right? She, you know, when she says millennials have this weird feeling that they're being economically snowballed. And then she has that great discussion at the end about Gen Z, right? Thinking that like gender discrimination is off the charts. And she's like, that's not the case, right? We're actually in a better world on all of those markers than we were before. But I don't know what the answer is. I've been thinking a lot about this pessimism actually before I even read this book, because it's so pervasive in my classrooms. And so yeah, as a faculty member, I try to push back on it, but it's also something that I've been trying to do more public writing about as well. But I don't have a good answer because I think culturally we're in a place that we have set young people up to reject exactly the institutions that have gotten us as far as we are. And that's very concerning.
So I think it would be an important research topic to try to get at what this pessimism is. My instinct is, if I were to tell people, this is the data, it wouldn't get anywhere. Somehow I think the pessimism is probably so deep-seated that they would just say, well, you're out of touch. That would be their reaction to me if I did that. And I wonder how much of it is just sort of personal, that somehow the way people are growing up, just pessimism strikes them as the right reaction to the world as they perceive it. Mm-hmm. Whether it's the situation in their family or with their peers, or how life looks to them on social media. Somehow pessimism might seem like the only the only plausible mood. Anything else, so anything that comes along and reinforces that becomes data, and anything that comes along and goes against that becomes something that just bounces off as, well, that comes from somebody I don't really trust.
Mm-hmm. I'll just add one more thing. One of my evolutionary psychology professors in undergrad pointed out that, one of the things that I think feeds into this, and we weren't talking about pessimism per se, but he pointed out that humans are not actually, and a lot of this actually goes into human economics more broadly, right? We're not naturally attuned to absolute status signals, right? It doesn't matter to us how well we're doing in sort of absolute terms, because what really matters from an evolutionary perspective is how we're doing relative to our peers, right? That's how natural selection actually operates. And so we're very highly attuned to relative status signals, and we're very not attuned to these absolute sort of markers of flourishing. And so I think social media creates this absolute cesspool of confusing relative comparison groups, right? So you have people who grew up on the Kardashians, right? And if you somehow trick yourself into thinking that the Kardashians are the relevant comparison group for you, of course you're going to be unhappy, right? Because they have like 8 mansions each and whatever. So I think but I mean, even like Instagram does this, right? I mean, people get into this, they start comparing themselves not to other people's reality, but the relevant comparison group becomes the best versions of people that they stick on social media. And that's partly what she attributes to the rise of the catastrophic rise of depression among young girls, right? Is that their relative relevant comparison groups are just off the charts, right? They're not realistic anymore. So I think you have to do a lot of like self-education, but you also have to, as a parent, I think about this a lot. I have 3 daughters. And so I think a lot about what their access to social media is going to look like and how that I am going to help them navigate social media. They will certainly not have unrestricted access to social media anytime soon. But then culturally, I think there needs to be a broader conversation. And I think a lot of classical liberals, because of our realistic optimism, have a strong role to play there. Whether we're doing it well enough or not is another question. But
I had a coworker who said, if you want to be miserable, spend your time focusing on your coworkers who seem to work less than you and make more money. And if you want to make yourself happy, think of the coworkers who seem to work more than you and make less money. And people have a hard time doing the latter, but that kind of, I guess, on social media, you're unlikely to encounter the people who are, who appear to be less successful than you are, because everyone, your peers put on their best face. And then you have the celebrities, and you don't see all the people who have problems that you should be happy you don't have.
Yeah, I would say on the social media point, maybe it has something to do also with like, you can find a comparative advantage that might be fake. So like everyone can actually have this like facade almost of being more successful in whatever area, because I don't know, there's more information and you can also lie way easier. But thank you so much for your responses, and thank you for this. I will pass it on.
We now have Janet Buffton in the office as well. She'd like to ask a few questions.
Yes, hi. I know Lauren, but not Arnold. Hi. I had a question. So Adam Mastrianati, he has the experimental history Substack, and he was a guest on Econ Talk. He published through his Substack this like sort of academic paper, but not through peer review, where the finding was, he said, robust. I don't have the expertise to judge whether or not that's true, that people are really good at imagining how things could be better. Just if you give them an idea, you ask how things are, they're like, well, they could be better. And I'm curious, this might not be a generational question, but I'm curious what role you see in the fact that like we really do have institutional challenges right now. And this is going to affect different generations differently just by virtue of the fact that they're at different stages in their life. But the fact that like the main way that it seems like policy changes in the United States is by Supreme Court challenges, or a perception in Canada where I live that the government just can't do stuff. And then kind of maybe an atrophying of non-big state institutional governance to solve problems. And so that kind of mismatch, because between this ability to imagine how things could be better and this like evidence from the world that those opportunities are being taken, I wonder if you think that that might be relevant to these kind of questions, or if you think that it's just like totally divorced from the generational question.
well, I think, I don't know, Arnold, if you have any ideas on this. I don't know what the comparative, I mean, I would be interested to see if there's a generational, I know in my students, for example, they have zero economic understanding. Like they don't understand how markets work. They don't understand how prices work. When I ask them where prices come from, they say the government. I mean, like it's like nobody actually like understands. And this actually goes back to a broader point that I've been playing with, which is that a lot of the stuff that people want to reform are in fact complex adaptive systems. And it's very, very hard to even identify the problem to know what the solution should look like. So I think there's a problem of people not really having the background knowledge to figure out what reform should look like. I also think in the United States, and I suspect that this is the case in Canada, I mean, I do think polarization has actually sort of deformed our imagination in an important sense. Like we've been tricked into thinking that there's two pills, right? And we don't actually know that there's all of these other really complex, interesting possibilities for reform. And that includes not just markets and not just government, but civil society and mutual aid and all sorts of really, really neat ways in which humans have helped each other for thousands of years. But we've been kind of the polar binary has really harmed our ability to think imaginatively about human social problems. I don't know if that's a generational problem. I think that's more of, I think every generation that I come in contact with now has that same problem because we've all been shoved into this binary. But that could be also just because I've been thinking along those lines for a while. So this might just be availability bias. But so I would be interested to see if there's a generation effect. If there's, for example, boomers have more economic knowledge about or more knowledge about institutions or rule of law than Gen Z does, and what that might do to their thinking about how institutions reform. I don't know if that gets to your question, Janet.
I hadn't thought of that, so it does.
The one generational difference may be in the ability to think in terms of a process. So this will be me being old and cranky, but I will say that the anti-war generation, yes, we did, we marched and had protests and had walkouts and whatever, but we also thought that there was a process that we could go through to try to end the war, a political process, and we had a precise end result, to get turn the boats around and bring the troops home. Often nowadays you just have people upset. I mean, the George Floyd protests did not have much in terms of a specific agenda. This is something that Martin Gorey has pointed out a lot, that all around the world you have these protests that the incumbent leaders can't really satisfy because there's often no specific demand. And then there's so you're just expressing dissatisfaction. There's no organization. There's no one for anyone in a leadership position to negotiate with. And there's no sense of, this is a process of how you get social change. You go from here to there. It's just, you pop up, you protest, and then you go away. So anyway, I'm being very hard on the young generation, and Martin Gorey says that this is, well, he would also be hard on the young generation, but he says that this is kind of brought about by the social media environment, which gives you, especially in the context of this kind of individualist mindset, it gives you this idea that this is what activism is. There's no organized, systematic, linear process involved.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks, Janet. We do have one more person. Craig, would you like to answer or ask your question live? If you do, please raise your hand. I see you had chatted a few minutes ago. Let's see if we can. And I believe this will be our last question. Craig, you are ready to go.
Hello, and thank you very much for having this today. I appreciate it, both of you. My question is the negativity that we've been talking about just now. Something I hadn't picked up on as much as you both were saying, but I have been feeling that we get much more apocalypticism now than there's ever been. I feel like that's a societal trend, and I'm curious why we would have thought that we ever would be able to replace the boomers, and why we'd ever be able to go along with the status quo after the boomers retired and begin to pass, because there's such a large generation. The idea of growth has to end. Isn't that not correct?
I think
And wouldn't that
numerically,
be a cause? Sorry, go ahead.
numerically, millennials are actually pretty high. So we're not completely on this path now. Now, if millennials and subsequent people are pessimistic and don't have children, then you do, then would run into that problem.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, the apocalypticism, if that's a word. I mean, it's definitely an interesting feature. I noted somebody that I was reading linked to the Substack leaderboard, the leading Substacks. And of the top 15 or so, I think I saw only one that didn't have this characteristic of the other side is, really terrible things are going to happen if the other side wins, but I'm here to fight for you. And that's sort of sad that kind of, pugilistic, defensive, we're all in trouble if you don't help me out. I mean, on Substack of all places, which is probably one of the closest thing to a sane social medium, you can only imagine what that's like in on Twitter or newspapers or cable TV or what have you. So on that pessimistic note.
Well, I'd just like to thank everybody for joining us, especially Lauren. Thank you so much for sharing your time and thoughts with us. We look forward to seeing everybody next month, so please be on the lookout for the announcement for the next From the Shelf with Curator Arnold Kling. Thanks so much.